You're going to stand there the whole time? Or are you going to sit down?
You can edit it later.
Alright, it's a little awkward giving a presentation with just two people, but
Well, just talk. You don't have to present. Tell us what you're talking about.
alright, so today I wanted to go over a concept that I've been thinking about and kind of compiling information on for a little while now, maybe the past year or so. And that's the idea of what is the best way to train athletes for increased running speed, specifically athletes who are not track runners. I think that track athletes, there are some implications for for their training that are just significantly different than other athletes based on the fact that their sport is running. But as you know, a lot of the athletes that come in here, one of the primary goals that they have is to run faster. And when we were going through a goal setting session with some of our new athletes, and they come in and say, yeah, I want to run faster, I want to be quicker, I want to do this and that, they may have some preconceived idea about what speed training is for them, and it might not be necessarily the thing that they need to do to run faster. So today I just want to talk about the role of different muscles in sprinting, and a couple concepts and maybe just different ways of thinking about training to improve the function and specifically the strength of those muscles relative to what they're needed to do in sprinting. So in the past, when I've given lectures on speed training, I've taken a sort of kinetic versus kinematic approach. And I think that it's not a bad way to present this information, but it's lacking, now that I think more about it, it's lacking in a few ways. So before I would talk about different ways that we increase force and increase them appropriately relative to sprinting, and how that how athletes need to do this exercise or that exercise to increase the forces they create during running. And a lot of what I'm going to say during this presentation is the same, but before I would kind of break it up between that and then basically their technique with running, which is the kinematic aspect of it. And there's clearly some overlap between those two areas, but in terms of coming up with a presentation and outlining it, before I use that as the outline. Today it's going to be a little bit different, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page with some of the terms, I want to remind you guys about one of the most important principles that is governing our practice, and that's the specific adaptation to imposed demands, or the SAID principle. And that's just that the body specifically adapts to the demands that we impose upon it. So operating inside that paradigm, think about what the demands are for sprinting and what kind of demands we need to impose upon our athlete so that they can specifically adapt to those and get faster. Within that, there exists a lot of specificity in terms of different ways that specificity manifests itself. There are range of motion specificity, movement velocity specificity, muscle action. And so when we think about range of motion, if you spend your time strengthening a muscle in a certain range of motion, then it gets stronger specifically in that range of motion, and the carryover into other ranges is not as great. I'm not going to get super technical and do a lot of referencing during this talk, so just kind of bear with me. And then if you have questions about something specifically, I can talk more about the references or where I got that information. When we talk about movement velocity specificity, this is just the idea that if we want to move fast, some of our training has to be moving fast. And muscle action. So this one's a little more important in terms of what we're going to talk about later, and that's you know, that certain muscles act eccentrically and concentrically during sprinting, and they have different roles in terms of the percentage of eccentric and concentric work that they do, and it's probably prudent to sort of examine how those muscles work and then, you know, train specifically for that so that you have the adaptation in the right way. And then finally, a big part of this is going to be force vector specificity. So when we think about the force vectors, it includes both the direction and the magnitude of a force. You know, we know from you know, basic physics, if you think of your physics class in high school, when you're running and your feet are hitting the ground, it's hitting you back with an equal and opposite reaction. And so these reactions are the force vectors that we're going to concern ourselves today with. Kind of moving on from the introduction, I want to discuss the role of different muscles in sprinting. And when I talk about these things, I want you to understand that it is, what I'm speaking about is the primary role of these muscles. You know, if we wanted to break it down and talk about some really finite biomechanics during sprinting, of course we could pick some things apart and find out how these muscles may work in other ways or other actions that they have. But in general, I'm going to talk about how they work and how I think is important to understand the way that they work in relation to training athletes. So, and training these athletes to run faster. When we think about sprinting, and you know, it's something that we've all done and are familiar with the activity, it can be fairly confusing for multiple reasons. One, because you know, you're running fast, or the person you're observing is running fast, and so just the fact that movement velocity is so high, it's tough to discern what exactly is occurring at you know, in all their joints. The other thing is that, you know, when we think about the sort of primary joints that are involved, hip, knee, and ankle, there are a lot of muscles that cross all three of those joints in a lot of different angles, and you know, what we see is the sort of aggregate result of all of their muscles working together in a certain way, which is the athlete moving past us quickly. But when we break that down, there are a lot of things going on within that that are important to realize. So again, this is a very general and basic analysis of sprinting, but I think it's important to understand as we get into the later parts of the presentation. So in general, I kind of divide things up into a couple basic categories. So first we have our quads and calves. And you know, I know I'm lumping these together, but it's because as you run, these muscle groups primarily function to stabilize your knee and ankle joint, while other muscles are the primary drivers of the force and, you know, are creating high amounts of force to propel you forward. But the quads are working together with the hamstrings to create knee stiffness, and it's that stiffness that when you hit the ground, you're able to use your leg efficiently to create forces and propel yourself forward. So, you know, as we go through, think of the quads and the calves as acting in primarily an isometric way, with some eccentric function, but you know, they're working in a really high force situation to stabilize that leg. You know, that's their kind of primary role during sprinting. Also, kind of, not to get too sidetracked here, but there are some differences between the start of a sprint and the acceleration phase, the top speed phase, and then the trying to maintain that top speed, sort of the final slowdown. We're going to concentrate primarily on the acceleration and the top speed phase. And with that said, the role changes for the quads and the calves. the initial stages of the acceleration, especially if the person is starting out of blocks, which they shouldn't be because we're talking about non-track athletes. The quads and calves have a little bit more of a concentric role, but primarily they're functioning to stiffen those two joints. So when the prime movers of this action are firing at high velocities and high forces, that the force is efficiently translated through that segment and into the ground. So then the next category are sort of the prime movers of sprinting, and that's the glutes and the hamstrings. The glutes are a little more clear in terms of their role in sprinting. They're a big, powerful muscle that is great at creating hip extension. And so if you kind of imagine in your head somebody running by, their glutes are the thing that are powering them through most of that action. When you're in your stance phase, you're starting with your toe strike is a little out in front of your center of mass, but it quickly cycles through, and your foot is behind you through most of that on the ground. Your glute is the main driver of that hip extension and is imparting most of the forces into the ground. But it's combined with your hamstring. And your hamstring's a little trickier, being biarticular in nature. It serves two roles. One as a prime mover of hip extension, but then also it serves in combination with your quads to maintain stiffness in your knee joint. So if you think your foot is landing on the ground, your knee is not changing angle much, and your ankle is not changing in the angle much when it's on the ground. Your glute is creating this really high force, and it's creating that really rapidly in combination with your hamstring to extend your thigh beyond your body. So, and then I wrote trunk up here. I wrote that because I didn't want to neglect it, but in terms of the scope of this conversation, we're not going to get too much into that. But your trunk certainly has a role in maintaining, your trunk musculature certainly has a role in maintaining your trunk position during sprinting, which is important. Especially during the acceleration phase, the anterior part of your trunk musculature is helping keep your body lean down so that your center of mass can be further forward so that you can impart forces into the ground for longer and get yourself up to speed. And then on the back side of the trunk, your spinal erectors have a role in maintaining stiffness in your trunk and along with your abs. And so it makes your body a more efficient system altogether. But we're going to keep our focus on basically the lower body musculature, just to keep this lecture somewhat abbreviated. Getting back to the role of all these things, when we think about how they function during sprinting, if the athlete's goal is to improve on their sprinting speed, we need to make sure that we are training these in a way that is going to accommodate the demands from the sport. So that has a lot of implications in terms of the exercises we select, the orientation of those exercises, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and also the way in which we program them in terms of the beginning or the end of the training session, as well as selecting the resistance and looking at something that's going to allow us to have high movement velocity versus low movement velocity, and thinking about how those will have an effect. As we get into this kind of area of training recommendations, we're going to talk a little bit more about force vector specificity. Now, I wrote up here also in the weight room, because it's a little out of the scope of this, again, to talk much beyond what we can do, in this facility or in the weight room. I could discuss a little bit more about my thoughts on how to program different jumping or plyometric exercises, but to keep this somewhat concise, I'm just going to talk about the different lifting things that we do. So within the idea of force vector specificity, we need to consider the exercises that we typically program, or that an athlete typically has programmed for them, and the force vector relative to their body, and all of that relative to the demands of our sport, or of sprinting in this case. So, we already kind of went over that the concept of your body specifically adapting to the demands we impose upon it. So now we want to think about the force vectors that are incurred during sprinting. And a lot of this information is taken from different people that I've read, and so don't think that I invented any of this. It's just me stealing it from other people who are much smarter than me. But this is sort of my interpretation and how I put it all together in my head. But there's a great article by Morin, who's a researcher in France, who looked at what differentiates different levels of sprinters. So basically he had one sprinter in the study who was very elite and who competed in the last Olympics. And then there were some other sprinters of varying levels, some that were at the sort of sub-elite level, some that were, I believe, collegiate level. But all of them were very good sprinters, but there was the definite level. The other thing that makes this really nice is it's pretty easy to classify sprinters because you've got their times and you can just say, okay, this guy's better than this guy, better than this guy. But what he did was take all these different sprinters and run them on an instrumented treadmill. So a treadmill that has force plates built into it. And there was also they were running with a belt that had that was basically measuring their force that they were pulling with. So it had some kind of force measuring device hooked to their body at about their center of mass. So the idea of this study was to take these sprinters and try and differentiate what makes this guy faster than this guy. Is he creating higher forces? Is he creating forces in different directions? Is he moving his limbs faster? All these different factors they looked at. And what they found was that the biggest differentiator between the best sprinters and the other levels of sprinting, or other levels of sprinters, was that the direction of their force was very different. So whether you're the best sprinter or an intermediate sprinter or sub-elite or wherever you fall in there, the thing that differentiates you the most is not how much force you create, but is the direction of the force. Now, I think when we look at this study and we apply it to the athletes we work with, one thing we really need to think about is the sort of external validity of it, and does any of this information make a difference when we're working with a 15-year-old soccer player or a 22-year-old basketball player who wants to improve their speed. And I think that it does, and there's an important point about improving the direction of their force and how we're going to implement that idea into our training. But I don't think we should ignore the magnitude as well. So in the study, they didn't find significant differences in the magnitude of different sprinters, but I think that's because their group was so homogeneous that the differences didn't really manifest themselves. But if they looked at a wider variety of athletes, or maybe athletes who sprinting wasn't their primary sport, maybe soccer players, that they would find some differentiation between the magnitude of the force you create and the velocity with which you run. That's kind of my opinion for what it's worth. But So when we think about the force vector specificity, we're looking at the direction and the magnitude. And based on that study and a few others that I've read, I think that, again, my opinion, that these are both important things to focus on when we're thinking about how to make somebody faster. I feel like it's pretty intuitive as well. If you create higher forces, into the ground, the ground is hitting you with an equal and opposite reaction. So those greater forces are going to propel you, with more force in some direction. And then if you have a more efficient direction, meaning you're, working on this, then that's going to make you faster. That sounded maybe overly simplistic, but higher forces in a more efficient direction makes you faster. So now we kind of established that these are both important things, how do we take these ideas that we're going to train the direction and the magnitude of the force and insert them in to this idea of running mechanics where we're maintaining knee and ankle stiffness with the quads and calves and using our glutes and hamstrings as our primary driver. How do we make these direction and magnitude match up with each of these individual components to create this aggregate effect of going fast, going forward fast. Let's just kind of take a step back and look at different exercises that are in a lot of athletes' programs. And these are things that you've had exposure to and, in many situations. Let's think of probably the most typical things. So if I ask you for a survey of, what are the sort of most common components of an athlete's training program that they do in the weight room, we may find some collection of squatting, deadlifting, lunging, various Olympic lifts. We want to include snatches, cleans, and all their sort of, different varieties of snatches and cleans and jerks and all of these other Olympic style lifting things. When we think about those, I think that all of those exercises are great, and if you use them correctly, they can be an excellent part of anyone's program. But one thing that I want you to think about in terms of the similarity in all of those is that they have a vertically oriented force vector. So whether you're squatting, deadlifting, cleaning, snatching, all of these things, lunges, step-ups, the force that you're creating is vertical. You're pushing straight down against the ground. Even leg press, you can lump that in there as well. But all of these things are creating forces relative to our body that are up and down. So when we think about these and, in relation to improving speed and what we just talked about with the Morin study is, are these appropriate for someone whose primary goal is running faster? And, what I would say is, yeah, they are. They're an appropriate part of their program, but if you only did those exercises, I think that you're leaving something out, and there's still a lot of area to be exploited in terms of making someone faster. And primarily because all of these have this vertical force vector, and the force, the big differentiator that we talked about is that you need to get your forces going horizontal. So I think that there is a bit of a disconnect between a lot of people's programming and what they actually need to make themselves faster. So with that said, the next group of exercises are exercises that have a horizontally, a horizontal force vector relative to our body. So when I say relative to our body, you need to think that in some of these exercises you're going to be laying down, and so you're still going against gravity. You're moving the weight against gravity. So the force vector itself may seem vertical because you're pushing a weight up, but if you orient your body laying down, then the force relative to your body is horizontal. Does that make sense? Okay. Also, within this, there's a little bit of a gray area because some of these exercises have what's almost a combination of vertical and horizontal force vectors, and it actually becomes kind of a rotating force vector depending on the segment of the lift that you're in. But you know, let's just kind of look at these on an individual basis. So the first one I have is hip thrust, and with a lot of athletes, I tend to do this by putting their back up on a bench and their feet on the ground. There are other ways in terms of like a barbell pelvic bridge is another basically variation of this lift where their back is on the ground and their feet are on the ground. I've seen people doing it with their back on a bench and their feet on a bench. I think that, you know, rotating through those different scenarios is probably a good idea for most athletes, but I think from a feasibility standpoint, doing them as Brett Contreras has suggested with the back on a bench tends to work, in my experience, a little bit better than the others. Just logistically get people sliding all over the place, and it's the best way that I've found to actually be able to load up the exercise with a high load and you know, have them do it without sliding all over the room. So the next exercise are reverse hypers, and you're both familiar with that. You know, again, if you think about the orientation of the forces through your body, this is one where we get a little bit of rotational force, or a rotating force vector, but it's still fairly horizontal. So in terms of making this easily understandable and a little more simplistic, I'm kind of lumping it in that category because I think it fits there best. Next we have back extensions. Whether you're doing these on a 45-degree back extension or if you're doing them on the reverse hyper, they still have a fairly horizontally oriented force vector. And you know, you can imagine, depending on the setup that you use, whether you have their legs completely straight or if they're on the 45-degree back extension, the angle of the force vector relative to your body changes a little bit, but I still think that it's significantly different from these vertical exercises so that it should be included as a horizontal exercise. And then finally we have glute ham raises. Now, I have a star here, or what I try to make a star here, because these are a little bit different because now, if you think about all the similarities of these, they're all hip extension, and then glute ham raises are a knee extension exercise. Well, your knee's not really extending very much. Your knee's not changing angle that much when you're in your stance phase. So I put these on here because they are a horizontally oriented exercise, but they're not really, they don't really fit in with the rest of these in terms of the muscle action being specifically aimed towards the role of the muscles and the sort of the specific actions that are occurring during sprinting. So I don't know why I included it. I guess I was just trying to think of more horizontally oriented exercises and put it up there just to kind of demonstrate that. But I think it gets away from the specificity a little bit. I certainly think the glute ham raises are a great exercise for a lot of reasons, but they don't quite fit in here. But when we think about including these other three or different variations of these other three, you can imagine that the hip extension mechanism for these things is really much more similar to what we have during sprinting and what we're trying to get out of our athletes during sprinting in terms of creating forces that are in that proper direction.